why don't we train Nepali professionals on how to use drone technology safely, responsibly, and effectively? They're already in country. They don't have to fly in from halfway across the world. They already know the language, they already know the culture, and they have a strong incentive of using this technology well.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 86. How are drones used in humanitarian relief efforts? If you ask today's guest, he'd say that not only are they saving lives, but they're creating real, sustainable economic opportunities for local populations. Patrick Meier is an internationally recognized expert in the field of humanitarian technology. He has consulted for the UN, the Red Cross, World Bank, and numerous other organizations. His book, Digital Humanitarians, shares remarkable real-life stories of how humanity, coupled with innovative solutions to big data, is changing humanitarian response forever. He founded the Humanitarian UAV Network, an organization of 2,500 members in 80-plus countries with a mission to promote the safe, coordinated, and effective use of UAVs for data collection and use. He is also a consultant and author of several articles on humanitarian efforts and technology. Patrick presently serves as the executive director and co-founder of We Robotics, an organization that scales the positive impact of humanitarian aid, development, and environmental projects through the use of robotic solutions, most notably drones. Patrick is here to talk about We Robotics, how drones are used in humanitarian efforts, and how digital humanitarians are saving lives and creating sustainable economic opportunities with drones. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Patrick to introduce himself.
So my name is Patrick Meier, and I've been working in the humanitarian technology space for well over 10 years now. And that means really applying emerging technologies to support a wide range of humanitarian efforts.
You call people who work in this field digital humanitarians. Can you elaborate?
I started using the term digital humanitarians really in the context of crowdsourcing, really, at the beginning. What we've seen with the rise of technologies, in particular mobile phones, smartphones, social media, and a more hyper-connected world, is the ability for pretty much anybody who's connected to be able to support humanitarian efforts on the other side of the planet by monitoring social media, mainstream media, by making sense of data that gets generated during disasters and sharing that information with humanitarian organizations. And so what digital humanitarians use are humanitarian technologies in order to support humanitarian relief efforts.
Can you provide an example of when this concept was first observed?
I think in many respects, the first milestone is the devastating earthquake in Haiti back in January 2010. When a massive earthquake struck just outside of Port-au-Prince and resulting in hundreds of thousands of casualties. And within a few hours, colleagues and I started what's called a crisis map. So that's an example of a humanitarian technology, basically a digital, online, interactive, relatively live, real-time map where we were pinpointing needs and damage and so on. And we were getting that information primarily through social media as well as then mainstream media. But it was really a lot of the content, especially during the first couple of days, that were coming from many of the Haitians that were tweeting live or Haitian diaspora that had organized Facebook groups and were sharing information that they were receiving from their loved ones at home. And what my colleagues, friends, and I did was simply take that information, this kind of unstructured information, and turn it into actual reports of needs and damage, which we would then add to a map to basically display where across Haiti these needs were being expressed and where the heaviest damage was being reported.
The fact that data is compiled in real time, is that what makes it relevant to a digital humanitarian, or is it the resulting report?
It can be both, but really the novelty around crisis mapping was the ability to start sourcing a map with near real-time data. So we didn't call them crisis maps until 2006, but we've had the use of risks maps and disaster maps for decades in the humanitarian space. When I was working years ago in the Sudan, these maps were poster-sized maps, paper-based maps that were taped on walls of an office during disasters or after. And so those are not necessarily being updated very regularly or systematically, because at the time you simply didn't get the kind of data in the kind of speed that we do have now. And so what crisis maps today allow us to do is actually to understand how a disaster is unfolding, how and who are being affected and where, not 3 weeks later, as has been the case for decades, but 3 hours later, if not 3 minutes later. And of course, the faster you can assess needs, the faster you can start assisting, and the more you can actually do this without too much guesswork, which is unfortunately most of the time the case. And this is not a criticism at all. I've been involved in humanitarian efforts. That's just the nature of the situation. There's a sort of like a fog of information that happens, and you don't know who's been affected how badly. But now we don't need to guess as much. The information becomes available far more quickly than ever before. And so that means theoretically that we should be able to assist a lot faster in far more efficient and targeted ways.
Can you talk about some of the major humanitarian efforts you've been involved in and what happened?
Sure. It started way back when, 2001, 2002, where I started getting interested in the field of disaster early warning, conflict early warning, and so on. So I did some work specifically to begin with in the Horn of Africa, helping to set up humanitarian early warning systems in the region. This was Ethiopia, Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya. So I did that quite actively, helping to set up a regional humanitarian early warning system there, and then did some work with UNICEF in Somalia, still in some parts related to the field of humanitarian early warning, but also looking at issues of how women and children are affected by conflict and extended protracted conflict. Did that in the Western Sahara, just south of Morocco. So that was basically 2001, 2003, 2004, really very deeply involved in this early warning field, which really was the early predecessors of the crisis mapping field, because we were starting to create digital maps. We were starting to use what's called GIS, Geographic Information Systems, for the purposes of humanitarian early warning. But when I was doing that back in 2001, 2002, that data was not being updated more than, frankly, every quarter. So that's kind of hard to do the kind of work we were doing. If we were going to have to do early warning and the data's a month old, that's no longer early warning. But that was really the predecessors of what eventually then, when I joined the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative at Harvard University, where I co-founded and co-directed a program on crisis mapping in 2006 through to 2009, that's when we started learning more about the possibilities that social media might bring. Keep in mind, back in 2006, social media was still very, very new, and Google Earth had just launched the year before. And so there started to be some really exciting technologies emerging that, got a lot of us in the humanitarian space thinking about, what does that mean for us in the humanitarian space? What new opportunities present themselves, as well as what are the new challenges that we need to be very aware of?
The term crisis mapping implies that data is being collected during a crisis. But is there value in collecting data on a continuous basis so you're ready in case a crisis does occur?
So that's a really great question, because no matter what disaster you're in, you're always going to need to have what's called baseline data. In order to assess disaster damage, you have to know what the area looked like before. And so that's one area where also having geographic data that can be mapped for the purposes of risk assessments, disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness, and then having this baseline data in order to facilitate disaster damage assessments is absolutely key. And I would also say that while the bulk of the crisis mapping space is still very much focused on sudden onset disaster response efforts, I believe, and I've seen examples of crisis mapping being used for risk assessments, disaster preparedness, like I said, but also post-disaster recovery, post-disaster reconstruction as well. And so, yes, the word crisis in a way kind of focuses it on a very specific section of the disaster cycle. But there's absolutely no doubt that mapping and up-to-date high-resolution maps are important no matter where on this disaster cycle you are, whether it's 6 months before a disaster or 6 months after a disaster.
So what's the connection between digital humanitarians and drones?
I mean, I've always been interested in planes, airplanes. I wanted to be an airline pilot when I was a kid, but the fact that I wear glasses kind of got in the way. So I've always had an interest in aviation, and I was born and raised in Africa and had the opportunity to travel quite a bit while growing up, with my career today. And it was really, though, in 2007 when I was doing a project for the United Nations Foundation looking at emerging technologies for crisis management and so on, that I had a very interesting call with the world meeting in person with the World Food Program in Rome, who happened to mention that they were starting to actually explore the use of drones. And this was 2007. And while I had heard about drones and so on, still at the time the connotation was almost 100% on military assets. But I was so interested that I actually extended my stay in Italy, because it turned out that they were partnering with an Italian university that had an engineering department that was actually building the drones for the World Food Program. And it was just, it really got me very interested. So I spent a couple of days at that university talking with the faculty, with the students. And from that moment onwards, just kept being interested. But it was also really another milestone that got me far more involved. And this was in 2013. So, a good 6 years after those discussions, when I was seconded to the United Nations in the wake of Typhoon Haiyan, which was a Category 5 typhoon in the Philippines. And within a few days of arriving in Manila, I had already come across half a dozen teams that had brought some drones in to carry out aerial surveys of disaster damage and to support other kinds of humanitarian efforts. And that was a milestone as far as the use of drones for humanitarian efforts. It was the number of teams that showed up out of nowhere was really completely unprecedented. And I find that very exciting. And I was like, wow, well, it's been 6 years. Maybe now's the time, with the technology becoming more commercially available and at a price point that we in the humanitarian space can actually afford. Maybe it's time to reconsider, or not reconsider, but it's time to go back to this technology and explore this more seriously now. But I have to say, as I started talking to these different teams that had shown up, it became very clear to me that most were not talking to each other or didn't even know about each other. Most were not sharing imagery with the humanitarian space because they had no idea how to interface with the humanitarian efforts. Nor were they sharing imagery, for the most part, with either government, or local communities. And that was, for me, that realization in Manila where the light bulb went off and I said, okay, it's time to do something about this. It's time to set up a coordination mechanism, best practices, codes of conduct, and so on, so we do this the right way.
Is that the reason why We Robotics was formed?
In many respects, that was a predecessor, really, to We Robotics. And it was 2 years later, in 2015, when I was involved at the United Nations request, supporting humanitarian efforts following another major disaster, this time in Nepal, devastating 8.0 earthquake there. I was asked by the UN to help coordinate drone response efforts. And frankly, it was a disaster. There were a dozen teams that showed up from all around the world, but mostly the US, that were either from drone companies, that manufacturers, or the engineering drone types who unfortunately had zero experience in humanitarian efforts, had never been to Nepal for that matter either, did not speak the language, did not understand the customs, the culture, any kind of cultural sensitivity. And it was a major fiasco. It was a circus. It ended up creating more harm, in my opinion, than good. It created more difficulties than it solved problems, having these dozens of teams that were really, just like herding cats in many respects. And that, for me, when I was in the middle of trying to make sense and order out of chaos, was when I got so frustrated that I said, we cannot possibly let this happen again. Not that we necessarily have that kind of control, but I got thinking more and more, why don't we train Nepali professionals on how to use drone technology safely, responsibly, and effectively? They're already in country. They don't have to fly in from halfway across the world. They already know the language. They already know the culture, and they have a strong incentive of using this technology well. And so that was really, for me, it's like, okay, it's all fine and well to have a global network of drone pilots and so on, but that's not where I see the biggest need. And so that was really then the impetus for We Robotics, this idea and this vision around let's build local capacity. Let's enable local partners in at-risk developing countries around the world to use this technology for a wide range of humanitarian development, environmental efforts, and let's enable them to also make money off this technology so that it becomes a sustainable technology for many years to come. So that's really goes to the heart of We Robotics.
So let's talk a little more about We Robotics. How do you work with a region in need to do the things you've outlined? Increase the capacity, get people using drones, and then build a local economy?
So the way that, I've described the vision of We Robotics, and the way that we actually implement this vision are through local innovation labs. We call them flying labs. And these flying labs are run by locals for local projects to address local priorities and challenges. And so we use these flying labs to transfer the professional technical skills that are requested from our local partners, from our local flying labs. And we also transfer the appropriate robotic solutions, the appropriate drones, the appropriate marine robotic solutions that are the best fit, that make the most sense for the challenges that our local partners are looking to solve. Within that context of providing the local training, local technology transfer, and so on, we also work with our local partners to set up a number of projects for the first phase. So we set up a number of projects so that they immediately are able to implement and practice their skills that they've learned. So it's very, very practical and action-oriented. And once that's done and they're able to happily do this on their own, and occasionally if they need remote support, of course, we're there, that gets us to the fourth and final phase of our four-phase framework for the Flying Labs, which is helping to incubate a local startup around robotics as a service or drones as a service. And for that, which we're going to be doing in the next couple of months in Nepal, so we have flying labs in Nepal, in Tanzania, and in Peru, so in these three continents, and that's very deliberate. But we'll be in Nepal back in Nepal in a couple of months to provide training on entrepreneurship, business management, how to develop business models, and so on. And then we'll be running a business plan competition in Nepal for startup ideas, and then awarding the winning team with some seed investment, some seed funding to set up their own company and get started as drones as a service so that they can start making some money off this technology and the skills that they've learned. And of course, we continue providing business coaching. We drive international clients to them as well, which we're already starting to, by the way. So that's really, really key. And in Peru, we're also doing the same thing with our flying labs there. And I should note that, all our flying labs have different local flavors because they're interested in sometimes different issues. And so it's very much of a demand-driven model. So that in the case of Peru, the local flying labs there is interested in the use of drones for cargo delivery, for transportation of essential medicines and vaccines and so on, using cargo drones. And we just returned from the Amazon rainforest, where we carried out the first ever field tests of cargo drones to deliver essential medicines to a very remote village in the Amazon. And so the partners there, the flying labs there, is already now exploring the possibility of then spinning off a local company from the flying labs in Peru that would be the first company in Peru, and I believe in Latin America, that is looking to provide cargo drone services in the region. Now, of course, this is very early days, but with respect to the question you asked, this is very, very core to our flying labs model and mandate.
Is Nepal your oldest flying lab?
It's the first one we started on, about 5 months after the earthquake in 2015. As we were setting up the idea behind We Robotics, our first ever project, we didn't even have the name We Robotics yet, was in Nepal. So in September 2015, where we went back and started providing local training to Kathmandu University and a number of local NGOs around how to use the technology. We transferred 10 drones as well as software to these partners so that they could be in position to do this themselves in the future. And they've since gone on and done some fantastic projects, some of which we've documented on our blog at We Robotics. And that's exactly what it's all about, is helping and enabling the use of this technology in a safe, responsible, and effective manner. And so we're very excited about that. And We were back in Nepal in September 2016 to do trainings on a different kind of drones for different kinds of projects, which we've transferred. And just last week, the first half of January, we were back in Nepal as well with more drones to transfer and more projects. We just completed the aerial mapping of the second largest landslide in the country of Nepal at the request and in support of some of our humanitarian partners there. So I think now we're going to be following up with the business training, the business model competition, and so on. So, Nepal is definitely the furthest ahead, followed close tie with Peru and Tanzania.
How many people are participating in the program in Nepal?
In September 2015, we had trained 36 participants, the majority of which were engineering students from the School of Engineering at Kathmandu University, but there were also representatives from local NGOs, and the Civil Aviation Authority of Nepal participated. In that training I ran. Last September, it was my CTO of We Robotics that ran the training. I don't remember the numbers there, but I can dig those up. And the past couple of weeks, that was really focused with 4 of the colleagues that are connected and running Nepal Flying Labs. We couldn't bring 50 people out, 12-hour drive into the Himalayas to do that. But ultimately, this is part of our approach is we start wide in terms of the training, and then we continue to specialize with fewer people who then take the responsibility of training larger groups. So the head of our flying labs in Nepal, Uttam, is now completely equipped and fully trained to train anybody else in Nepal so that we don't have to go back, which would defeat the whole purpose of setting flying labs. And so that capacity now is really there in country.
What's it like for you personally to see your vision actually coming to life when you're increasing local capacity and then seeing that capacity reinvested back into an area?
It really is amazing. And for me, there's so much to just be amazed about. But the thing that really just makes my day and is why I want to continue doing this for a long, long time is just the excitement that I see from the teams that we've been training in Nepal, the local teams, the local Nepalis, the local Tanzanians, the local Peruvians, the excitement, the sense of we can do this, it's us, we're driving this, it's in our hands. I still get WhatsApp messages from Nepal at 3 a.m. local time in Nepal whether it's the director of they're all young professionals, the director of our flying labs, Uttam, is WhatsApping me at 3 a.m. in the morning, his time, saying, I just got a new idea for doing this and this and this. That is contagious. That kind of excitement and passion and the sense of pride that our local partners are taking by being some of the first in their country, the first in their generation, to be using these technologies to improve their own countries. And the hours that they're putting in to make this happen, why would I want to be doing anything else, right? It's just incredibly rewarding.
Now, data can be compiled using a variety of methods. What do drones bring, and how important is drone technology to fueling this movement and the goals you're trying to achieve? Just
to be clear that this is not about a question of drone technology replacing other technologies. It's all very complementary, in my opinion. Maybe others differ on this, but the idea of integrating different sources of data, and this goes back to the field of crisis mapping, where you can layer aerial imagery on top of satellite imagery, on top of other kinds of GIS data in order to get far more of a contextual understanding of patterns and trends on the ground that are changing over time. And that's really what it's about. Each technology will have its own set of advantages and disadvantages when it comes to the collection of information, for example. Now, some of the advantages of drones is that if they're on site, i.e. if you already have a flying labs on site with the technology and the skills, you can get these birds up in the air in a matter of minutes, in a matter of hours. You're there, you've got the capacity, and so on. It still takes, speaking of Typhoon Haiyan that I mentioned from 2013, it took us 64 hours after the typhoon hit until we got the satellite imagery to start assessing the disaster damage. That's a very, very long time. In Nepal, after the earthquake, Kathmandu area remained cloudy for an entire week after the devastating earthquake, which made it, again, impossible to use satellite imagery. But in contrast, you can use drones to fly under the cloud canopy and start assessing disaster damage. So there are a number of circumstances and situations where this could make a really big difference. But again, it's complementary, in my opinion. You will then start using satellite imagery when it becomes available and integrating that with your analysis. So for me, it's this idea of cost savings, but also time savings in the collection of information that's necessary for humanitarian efforts. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And maybe to underscore and paraphrase your point, drones allow the local population to participate in a traditional humanitarian response as one of the responders, but maybe in a supporting role.
That's entirely correct. And first responders, by definition, have always been local communities, local partners. First responders are not the search and rescue team from Iceland that fly in 48, 72 hours later. And that's always been the case, that first responders are locals, and it will always be the case that first responders are local. So why not empower and enable first responders with appropriate technologies so that they can even be more effective and quicker in their response efforts? So it is, I think the word you use, participation, goes absolutely to the heart of this technology and to the heart of this digital humanitarian space. I mentioned, this really grew out of this notion of crowdsourcing and enabling people to be involved in one way or another. And what drones allow us to do is help bring local communities together and to take ownership of their response efforts, to take ownership of the data collection process and so on.
Patrick, what do you hope the lasting impact is going to be with the work that you're doing at We Robotics? And, of course, the humanitarian programs that you're implementing with drones?
Great question. I mean, there are different layers of that. The first is certainly helping to improve humanitarian efforts so that we don't see the kind of circus and fiasco we saw in Nepal when you had a bunch of outsiders come in and create more problems than solving solutions. So helping to enable and localize humanitarian efforts. So that's one, right? So improving humanitarian efforts, environmental projects, and development efforts. And the second is creating jobs, creating local jobs, high-tech jobs in these countries, helping to grow a demand for these services and skill sets, and enabling our Nepali colleagues, Tanzanian colleagues, and Peruvian colleagues to make a career out of this, where they have money and they can be successful and move forward in their professional lives. So that's something that is really important to me and that I hope we're able to accomplish.
That's it for episode 86 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Patrick Meier of We Robotics and learning how drones are being used in humanitarian efforts around the world. If you want more information on We Robotics or want to connect with Patrick, check out their website at werobotics.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a positive review on iTunes. It really does help. And as always, I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Gores.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.